Jack Reacher had no destination, which meant any stop was as good as another. The bus hissed to a halt in a place called Redemption, Arizona. The name was ironic, Reacher thought, for a town that looked like it had given up long ago. Dust swirled in the late afternoon sun, coating everything in a fine layer of ochre. A single main street stretched out before him, lined with buildings whose false fronts sagged like tired old men. He stepped off the bus, the only passenger to do so, and the doors immediately sighed shut behind him. The bus pulled away, leaving him in a cloud of diesel fumes and profound silence. He had a few dollars in his pocket, a toothbrush, and the clothes on his back. It was all he ever needed. His internal clock told him it was nearly 5 p.m. Time for coffee. A diner with a flickering neon sign promised hot coffee, cold beer. A practical combination. He pushed open the door, a small bell announcing his arrival with a cheerful, out-of-place jingle. The place was nearly empty. A couple of old-timers sat at the counter, nursing beers and staring into the middle distance. A young woman with tired eyes and a stained apron stood behind the counter, wiping it down with a damp cloth. She looked up as he entered, her eyes widening slightly at his size. At 6'5" and well over 200 pounds, Reacher was used to that reaction. He didn't look for trouble, but it had a way of finding him, often because someone misjudged his quiet demeanor as a weakness. He took a stool at the far end of the counter. "Coffee, black," he said. His voice was a low rumble, seeming to vibrate in the small space. The waitress nodded, her movements quick and efficient as she poured the coffee. It was thick, dark, and tasted faintly burned. Perfect. He took a slow sip, scanning the room. The old-timers hadn't moved. The only other occupant was a man in a booth by the window, wearing a suit that was too expensive for a town like Redemption. He was talking on his phone, his voice a low, angry buzz. Reacher took another sip of coffee and minded his own business. That was always the plan. But plans, like towns, had a way of falling apart. The front door swung open again and 3 men walked in. They were big, but soft in the way of men who relied on their size rather than skill. They wore matching work shirts from a local company, Thorn Mining. The name meant nothing to him. They swaggered over to the counter, crowding the space. The leader, a man with a thick neck and a beer belly, leered at the waitress. "Hey Sarah, how about a round for me and my boys, and a smile? Wouldn't kill you to smile." The waitress, Sarah, kept her expression neutral. "What'll you have, Hank?" Hank's grin faltered. He didn't like being ignored. His eyes swept the room and landed on Reacher. It was inevitable. Reacher was an anomaly, a stranger, a target. "Well, well, look what the cat dragged in," Hank said, his voice loud enough to fill the diner. "You lost, big guy?" Reacher didn't answer. He just took another sip of his coffee. This was the first step in a dance he knew all too well. Ignore, de-escalate. But some people see a lack of response as an invitation. Hank and his friends sidled over, flanking him. The air grew thick with the smell of stale beer and cheap aftershave. "I asked you a question," Hank said, poking a thick finger into Reacher's shoulder. Reacher slowly turned his head, his eyes meeting Hank's. He said nothing. He simply looked. He took in Hank's posture, the way his friends shifted their weight, the distance to the door, the weight of the ceramic coffee mug in his hand. He processed it all in a fraction of a second. "You deaf?" Another one of them sneered. "Leave him alone," Sarah the waitress said, her voice sharp. "He's not bothering anyone." Hank laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "We're just being friendly, making the tourist feel welcome." He turned back to Reacher. "Town's a private place, friend. We don't much like outsiders." Reacher finished his coffee and placed the mug carefully on the counter. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a couple of dollar bills, laying them next to the mug. "It was good coffee," he said to Sarah, his voice calm. Then he stood up. The simple act of him rising to his full height made the 3 men take an involuntary step back. Reacher was a wall of muscle, and his face was a granite mask of impassivity. He looked at Hank. "I'm leaving now," Reacher said. It wasn't a question or a request. It was a statement of fact. For a moment, Hank seemed to consider it. He could let the stranger walk out the door and his pride would be slightly bruised. Or he could push it. Pride, Reacher knew, made men do stupid things. Hank chose stupid. He threw a clumsy punch aimed at Reacher's face. Reacher moved with a speed that was shocking for a man his size. He didn't block the punch. He simply swayed his head an inch to the right, letting the fist whistle past his ear. As Hank's arm was extended, Reacher brought his right elbow up in a short, brutal arc that connected with the side of Hank's jaw. There was a sickening crack, and Hank's eyes rolled back in his head. He collapsed like a sack of cement, out cold before he hit the linoleum floor. The other two froze, their bravado evaporating instantly. They looked from their fallen leader to Reacher, who hadn't even broken a sweat. "I'm leaving," Reacher repeated, his voice still level. They scrambled out of his way as if he were on fire. Reacher walked to the door, gave a slight nod to the stunned waitress, and stepped back out into the dusty street. The sun was lower now, casting long shadows that looked like grasping fingers. He had been in Redemption for less than an hour, and trouble had already found him. He should have gotten back on the bus. But there was no bus. He started walking, heading for the edge of town, planning to just keep going until he hit the next one. He didn't get far. A police cruiser, cherry lights flashing but sirens silent, pulled up alongside him. A man in a sheriff's uniform got out. He was tall and lean, with a weathered face and a mustache that drooped at the corners. He looked tired. "That was quite a show back there," the sheriff said, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol. "I'm Sheriff Brody. And you are?" "Passing through," Reacher said. "You passed through Hank Miller's jaw pretty good," Brody said. "Assault is a crime in my town." "It was self-defense," Reacher stated. "He threw the first punch." Brody sighed, a long, weary sound. "Maybe. But Hank's father is Elias Thorne, and Elias Thorne owns the mine, which means he pretty much owns this town. So, a friendly word of advice? Get out of Redemption, now, before this gets complicated." Reacher looked down the long, empty road. Then he looked back at the sheriff. "Where's the next town?" 20 miles east. Good luck walking." Brody got back in his car, but he didn't drive away. He just sat there watching. Reacher started walking. The desert air was cooling rapidly as the sun dipped below the horizon. The silence was absolute, broken only by the crunch of his boots on the gravel shoulder. He had walked about 2 miles when the headlights appeared behind him. It wasn't the sheriff. It was a big black pickup truck, the kind Thorne Mining probably owned by the dozen. It slowed to match his pace. The passenger window rolled down. It was Hank's 2 friends, and this time, they had a tire iron. "Thorne sends his regards," the driver grunted, and then the truck swerved, aiming straight for him. Reacher didn't hesitate. He dove into the ditch by the side of the road as the truck roared past, its huge tires missing him by inches. He rolled and came up on his feet, adrenaline singing in his veins. The truck screeched to a stop 100 yards down the road, its reverse lights flaring. They were coming back. He wasn't going to get caught in the open. He scrambled up the other side of the ditch and started running, not along the road, but out into the scrub desert. The truck's engine roared as it tried to follow, but the terrain was too rough. The 2 men bailed out, shouting curses into the darkness. Reacher kept moving, using the deepening twilight as cover. They were clumsy and loud. He was silent and focused. He circled around, moving through the sparse mesquite and creosote bushes until he was behind them. They were standing near their truck, peering into the darkness, the tire iron glinting in the moonlight. "Where'd he go?" one of them asked nervously. "He can't have gone far," the other replied, trying to sound confident. He was closer than they thought. Reacher exploded from the shadows. He took out the man with the tire iron first, a single, precise strike to the back of the knee that sent him down with a scream of pain. The second man spun around, his eyes wide with panic, and swung wildly. Reacher ducked under the punch and drove his shoulder into the man's chest, lifting him off his feet and slamming him against the side of the truck. The man's head hit the metal with a hollow thud, and he slid to the ground, unconscious. Reacher took the tire iron from the first man who was now whimpering on the ground, clutching his ruined knee. Reacher looked down at him, his face unreadable in the moonlight. "Tell Thorne to leave me alone," he said, and then he tossed the tire iron into the desert. He turned and walked away, not back towards the road, but deeper into the darkness. He needed to disappear for a while. But something had changed. This was no longer about just passing through. They had tried to kill him. They had made it personal. He found a dry wash and followed it, moving parallel to the highway. He needed to think. Elias Thorne, a man who owned a town and sent thugs to enforce his will. Sheriff Brody, who knew what was happening and chose to look the other way. A town called Redemption that seemed to offer anything but. He walked for hours, the moon his only companion. By dawn, he was miles away, but he wasn't leaving. He was circling back. He needed answers. He walked back towards Redemption from the opposite direction, coming in from the east. He was tired, thirsty, and his shirt was torn. He looked like a vagrant, which suited him just fine. He wanted to be underestimated. He slipped back into town as the sun was rising, avoiding the main street. He found a small park and sat on a bench, hidden by an overgrown oleander bush. From there, he could watch the town wake up. He saw Sheriff Brody's cruiser roll by. He saw Thorne mining trucks rumbling through the streets. He saw the waitress, Sarah, walking to the diner, her shoulders slumped with weariness. Everything looked normal. Too normal. Reacher knew the look of a town with a secret. He'd seen it a dozen times before, a place where fear hung in the air like dust, so pervasive that people stopped noticing it. That's what Redemption felt like, and now he was part of its secret. Around mid-morning, he saw the man from the diner, the one in the expensive suit. He was coming out of a small, nondescript office building across the street. The sign on the door read, "Redemption Land Development." The man looked agitated, constantly glancing over his shoulder. He got into a sleek sedan and drove off quickly, heading out of town. Reacher committed the man's face and license plate to memory. Information was ammunition, and he needed all he could get. His stomach rumbled. He needed food and more coffee. He decided to risk the diner again. This time, it was busier. The morning rush. He took the same stool at the end of the counter. Sarah saw him, and her eyes went wide with a mixture of fear and surprise. She came over, keeping her voice low. "You're crazy for coming back here. Brody was looking for you. He said you assaulted 2 of Thorne's men." "They assaulted me first," Reacher said quietly. "With a pickup truck." Her face paled. "You need to get out of here. Seriously, these people don't play games." "I'll have a coffee," he said, "and some eggs." She hesitated, then nodded and went to put his order in. As he waited, he listened. He picked up snippets of conversation. Talk about the mine, about how times were tough, but there was an undercurrent of something else. Whispers about a man who had gone missing a few weeks ago, a geologist who had been asking too many questions. Sarah brought his food. "His name was Peterson," she said, so quietly he barely heard her. "The geologist. He was a nice man. He used to eat here. He said there was something wrong with the mine's reports. Something about the land they were buying up north of here." She looked terrified, as if just saying the words was a capital offense. Then one day, he was just gone. Before Reacher could ask more, the bell on the door jingled. Sheriff Brody walked in, followed by 2 deputies. Brody's eyes scanned the room and locked onto Reacher. A slow, grim smile spread across his face. "Well, look who's back," Brody said, his voice carrying across the diner. "Jack Reacher, or at least that's the name on the ID the military police faxed over. Quite a record you've got. Lots of commendations. And a few brawls." He walked over, his deputies flanking him. "I told you to leave town." "I got delayed," Reacher said, taking a bite of his eggs. "I'll bet you did," Brody said. "You're under arrest." "For what? A trumped-up assault charge?" Brody's smile vanished. "No, for the murder of Paul Allenwood." Reacher put his fork down. He didn't know who Paul Allenwood was. "That's the man in the expensive suit," Brody explained, as if reading his mind. "The land developer. A couple of kids found his car abandoned out on Highway 60, him inside it, shot twice in the chest, and guess what we found on the floor mat right next to the body? Brody paused for dramatic effect. The entire diner was silent, watching. A single crisp dollar bill, just like the ones you left on the counter here yesterday. A witness saw you arguing with him. Reacher knew it was a lie. He hadn't spoken a word to the man, but he also knew that didn't matter. The frame was in. It was neat, tidy, and it pointed directly at the convenient stranger who had already made enemies of the most powerful man in town. "Cuff him," Brody ordered his deputies. Reacher didn't resist. It wouldn't do any good here. He let them pull his arms behind his back and snap the cold steel onto his wrists. As they led him out of the diner, he caught Sarah's eye. She looked terrified, but there was something else there too. A flicker of doubt, a spark of defiance. They put him in the back of the cruiser. The town of Redemption looked the same as it did when he arrived, but now it felt different. It felt like a cage. And he was trapped right in the middle of it. The sheriff thought he had him. Elias Thorne thought he'd gotten rid of a problem. They were both wrong. They hadn't trapped a random drifter. They had trapped Jack Reacher, and he was about to tear their whole rotten town apart from the inside out. The cell was small, cold, and smelled of disinfectant and despair. A single slit window near the ceiling offered a view of a brick wall. Reacher sat on the thin mattress that passed for a bed and cataloged his situation. He was in a small-town jail, accused of a murder he didn't commit. The sheriff was either corrupt or incompetent, and the most powerful man in town wanted him gone, or worse. He had no lawyer, no phone call he wanted to make, and no allies, except, possibly, for a frightened waitress named Sarah. Hours passed. The silence was absolute. Reacher wasn't bored. He was thinking. He replayed every event since he'd stepped off the bus. The fight in the diner, Brody's warning, the attack on the road, the murder of the man in the suit, Paul Allenwood. The pieces were all there, but they didn't fit. The frame was too quick, too convenient. Killing Allenwood and framing Reacher required coordination. It suggested the murder was planned and Reacher was just an opportune scapegoat. Why kill Allenwood? Sarah had mentioned a missing geologist, Peterson, who thought something was wrong with the mine's land purchases north of town. Allenwood was a land developer. It was a connection, a strong one. Late in the afternoon, the cell door clanged open. It wasn't Brody. It was a young deputy, barely old enough to shave. He looked nervous. "Sheriff wants to see you," he mumbled, not making eye contact. They led Reacher to Brody's office. The sheriff was sitting behind a large wooden desk, feet propped up, chewing on an unlit cigar. He gestured for the deputy to leave, and they were alone. "You're a hard man to figure out, Reacher," Brody began. "Military police, top investigator. You leave a decorated career to become a ghost. Why is that?" "I like the quiet," Reacher said. Brody chuckled. "Well, you found the wrong quiet town. You see, things are simple here. People work at the mine, they buy their groceries at the company store, they drink at the town bar. Elias Thorne provides for them. He keeps things running, and I keep the peace. When an outsider comes in and disrupts that peace, I have to restore it. By framing him for murder? I've got a witness who saw you and Allenwood arguing," Brody said, his voice hardening. "I've got your dollar bill at the crime scene. A jury in this county will see an ex-military drifter with a history of violence who killed a respected businessman. Case closed." "You and I both know that's not what happened," Reacher said, his voice low and even. "You didn't even ask me for my side of the story. You just cuffed me." "Don't have to. The evidence speaks for itself." "The evidence was planted," Reacher countered, "which means you're either in on it or you're too stupid to see you're being used as a pawn." Brody's face flushed with anger. He slammed his feet to the floor and stood up, leaning over the desk. "You watch your mouth. You're in my jail, in my town. You have no rights here except the ones I give you." "Who killed Allenwood?" Reacher asked, ignoring the threat. "Was it Thorne? Did Allenwood find out what happened to the geologist, Peterson?" The mention of the name hit a nerve. A flicker of something. Surprise? Fear? Crossed Brody's face before he masked it. I don't know what you're talking about. Yes, you do, Reacher pressed. A man goes missing in a town this small. The sheriff knows. You know, and you buried it. Just like you're trying to bury me. Get him out of my sight, Brody roared, and the young deputy scurried back in. As he was being led back to his cell, Reacher knew one thing for sure. Brody wasn't the mastermind. He was a man in over his head, probably taking Thorne's money to look the other way, and now he was caught in something far more serious than petty corruption. He was scared, and scared men make mistakes. That night, Reacher didn't sleep. He listened. He heard the guards' footsteps, learned their patterns. He analyzed the lock on his cell door. It was old, but solid. He wouldn't be getting out that way. Not yet. He needed another way. He needed a lever. The next day, he got one. A different deputy brought his lunch tray. It was Sarah. She wasn't in her waitress uniform. She was wearing a deputy's khaki shirt and pants. It looked 2 sizes too big for her. They were short-staffed, she said quietly, sliding the tray through the slot. Her hands were trembling. I'm a reserve deputy. Just do weekends and fill in sometimes. What are you doing here? Reacher asked. I told Brody I didn't think you did it, she whispered, glancing nervously down the hall. I told him Hank started that fight. He told me to mind my own business. But I can't. My brother, he worked at the mine. He had an accident last year, a bad one. They said it was his fault, but he was always so careful. Thorne gave my family some money and everyone just forgot about it. People are afraid of him. What happened to that geologist, Peterson? And now this. It's not right. Here was his ally, scared but with a core of steel. Allenwood was a land developer, Reacher said, his voice urgent. You said Peterson was looking into land deals north of town. Is there a map in the sheriff's office? A county map? Yes, on the wall, she said. Look at the land Thorne has been buying. Look at the names on the deeds. See if Allenwood's company was involved. It's a place to start. What if they see me? Be smart about it, Reacher said. You belong here. They won't suspect you. She bit her lip, then gave a firm nod. Okay, I'll try. She left, and Reacher was alone again with his thoughts. He had planted a seed. Now he had to wait and see if it would grow. 2 days passed. The silence stretched, and Brody left him alone. It was a war of attrition. They expected him to break, to ask for a lawyer, to confess. They didn't know him. He could wait forever. On the 3rd night, Sarah came again, this time on the late shift. The station was quiet. She came to his cell, her face pale with excitement and fear. You were right, she breathed. Holding a piece of paper she'd folded into a tiny square, she passed it through the food slot. I looked at the map. Thorne Mining has bought up dozens of worthless parcels of land north of town over the last year. All of them were brokered by Paul Allenwood's company. But the land is just empty desert. It makes no sense. Reacher unfolded the paper. It was a list of parcel numbers. It makes sense if there's something on that land they don't want anyone else to know about. Something the geologist Peterson might have found. There's more, she said, her voice dropping even lower. I was tidying up Brody's office. I found this in his wastebasket. She passed another crumpled piece of paper through the slot. It was a lab report, torn in half. Reacher smoothed it out. It was a preliminary forensics report from the Allenwood crime scene. He scanned the technical jargon until he found what he was looking for. Tire tracks found at scene match tread pattern of Ford F-250 series pickup truck. The report also noted the type of soil found in the treads, a specific kind of red clay. The Thorne Mining trucks are all F-250s, Sarah said. And that red clay, it's only found in one place around here, up in the northern parcels, the ones Thorne bought. The frame was starting to fall apart. The killer drove a Thorne truck. He'd been to the northern properties. He'd killed Allenwood and dumped his body, then tried to pin it on Reacher. Brody saw this report, Reacher said. He knows the evidence points to one of Thorne's men, not me. And he tore it up. He's actively covering it up. What do we do? Sarah asked, her eyes pleading. Reacher looked at the steel door of his cell. Then he looked at her. Get me out of here. She stared at him, her heart pounding. How? I can't just unlock the door. You don't have to, Reacher said. Tonight, just before the shift change at midnight, there's a 10-minute window where the old guard is heading home and the new one hasn't settled in. Cause a distraction, a big one. Fake a fire alarm, report a brawl at the bar, anything to pull the one deputy on duty out of the station, leave the main evidence locker unlocked, and leave the back door of the station unlatched. What are you going to do? I'm going to get my own evidence, Reacher said, and then I'm going to have a talk with Elias Thorne. Sarah's decision was made in a heartbeat. It was a terrifying leap into the unknown, but the alternative, living in fear in a town run by a murderer, was worse. She nodded once, a sharp, determined gesture. Midnight. She slipped away, leaving Reacher in the darkness. He settled onto his cot, but not to rest. He was coiling, preparing. His time in the cage was over. The hunt was about to begin. The minutes ticked by, each one an eternity. Reacher listened to the sounds of the station, the rhythmic squeak of the deputy's chair, the hum of the fluorescent lights. He knew the routine by heart now. At 11:50 p.m., the lone night deputy would make one last round. Right on schedule, he heard the footsteps approaching. The deputy, a portly man named Miller, peered through the bars. Everything okay in there, Reacher? Couldn't be better, Reacher said calmly. Miller grunted and moved on. The footsteps receded. The station fell silent again. Reacher stood up, every muscle taut. He moved to the cell door, pressing his ear against the cold steel. He was counting. At precisely 11:58 p.m., the silence was shattered by the shrill squawk of the police radio. Sarah's voice, tight with feigned panic, crackled through the speaker. All units, we have a 10:57. Possible shots fired at the Rusty Spur Saloon. Repeat, shots fired. Reacher heard Deputy Miller curse under his breath. The Rusty Spur was the only bar in town. A Saturday night, there was always a powder keg. Miller wouldn't hesitate. Reacher heard the scrape of a chair, heavy footsteps hurrying towards the front of the station, and then the slam of a door. The engine of a cruiser roared to life and then faded into the distance. Silence. The station was empty. This was his chance. He reached through the bars and worked his fingers around the edge of the lunch tray Sarah had left earlier. It was thin, flimsy metal. He began to bend it, back and forth, working a corner against the edge of the food slot. The metal groaned in protest. He needed a shim, something thin and hard. After a minute of focused, silent effort, a small strip of metal broke free. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. The lock on his cell was an old pin tumbler lock. Primitive. Reacher had spent a significant part of his military career learning how to get into and out of places he wasn't supposed to be. He inserted the thin metal strip into the keyway, feeling for the pins. It was a crude tool, but his sense of touch was hyper-aware. He found the first pin, applied gentle tension, and pushed it up until he felt the faint click as it set. 1 down, 4 to go. His hands worked with a surgeon's precision. Pin 2, click. Pin 3, click. The fourth was stubborn. He adjusted the tension, probed again. Click. The last pin slid into place with a final, satisfying thud. The lock was open. He pushed the door slowly, careful to avoid any squeak of the hinges. He was out. He moved through the darkened station like a phantom. He found the evidence locker. As promised, it was unlocked. Inside, he found a box with his name on it. He ignored his own effects. He was looking for the file on Paul Allenwood's murder. He found it. He quickly located the torn-up lab report Brody had thrown away. Sarah had retrieved it, but Reacher knew the official file would contain a sanitized version. He was right. The copy in the folder made no mention of the truck tire tracks or the specific red clay soil. Brody had already replaced it, but tucked in the back, Reacher found the original evidence bag from the crime scene. It contained the dollar bill, and something else the lab techs had missed or been told to ignore. a tiny fleck of dark red mud clinging to the corner of the bill. The same red clay. The killer had been careless. He pocketed the evidence bag. He also took his own wallet and the few possessions they had confiscated. Then he slipped out the back door, which was unlatched just as Sarah had promised. He was free, but he was also a fugitive. The entire state would be looking for him within the hour. He had to move fast. The night air was cool and smelled of sagebrush. He needed to get to the northern parcels of land. It was miles away, and he couldn't use the roads. He set off on foot, cutting across the desert, using the moon and stars to guide him north. He moved at a steady, ground-eating pace. His mind was a whirlwind of calculations. Thorne had killed Peterson because the geologist discovered something valuable on that supposedly worthless land. Then he'd killed his own landman, Alan Wood, probably because Alan Wood got greedy or grew a conscience. Thorne had used one of his mining trucks for the job and had his sheriff clean up the mess, with Reacher as the perfect fall guy. It was a solid theory. Now he needed proof. It took him nearly 3 hours of hard walking to reach the area Sarah had described. The landscape changed. The flat desert gave way to low, rolling hills of dark red earth. He found tire tracks immediately, a heavy-duty truck, F-250. He followed them. The tracks led him to a small, isolated box canyon. At the entrance, a chain-link fence with a "No Trespassing, Thorne Mining" sign blocked the way. The gate was secured with a heavy chain and padlock. Reacher looked at the lock for a second, then looked at the metal fence posts set in concrete. He grabbed the top of the fence next to a post, braced his feet, and began to rock it back and forth. He used his entire body weight, grunting with the effort. The concrete groaned. With a final explosive heave, the post tore free from the dry earth. He bent the fence back just enough to slip through. Inside the canyon, the scene was one of clandestine industry. Portable floodlights illuminated a small-scale mining operation. It wasn't a gold or silver mine. Men were sifting through piles of the red clay using specialized equipment he didn't recognize. In the center of the operation was a small, prefabricated shed. He could see 2 men inside, hunched over a table. One of them was Elias Thorne. Reacher stayed in the shadows, watching. What were they mining for? It had to be something incredibly valuable to be worth 3 murders. He crept closer, moving from the shadow of one piece of heavy machinery to the next. He was 10 yards from the shed when a man stepped out for a smoke. It was Hank Miller, the man from the diner. His jaw was swollen and bruised. With him was the other man from the attack on the road. Thorne was using his dumbest muscle for security. A mistake. Hank saw the bent fence. He cursed and pulled out a radio. "Boss, someone's here. The fence is down." Thorne came out of the shed, his face a mask of cold fury. "Find them," he commanded. There was no more time for stealth. Reacher stepped out of the shadows. "Looking for me?" he said, his voice carrying easily in the quiet canyon. Hank and his cronies froze, their faces a comical mix of shock and fear. Thorne's eyes narrowed. He was surprised, but not scared. This was a man used to being in control. "Reacher," Thorne said, a slight hint of admiration in his voice. "I underestimated you. Brody assured me you were taken care of." "Brody works for you," Reacher stated, "just like these clowns." "He maintains order," Thorne corrected. "And you, my friend, are a disruption." "What is this place?" Reacher asked, gesturing to the operation. "What's in the dirt that's worth killing for?" Thorne actually smiled. "Curiosity, a fatal flaw. You see, this worthless land is rich in rare earth elements, neodymium, dysprosium, essential for everything from smartphones to missile guidance systems. The official geological surveys missed it. My man Peterson found it. He wanted to report it, be a hero. He couldn't be reasoned with." "So you killed him," Reacher said. "And Alan Wood?" Paul got nervous after Peterson disappeared, and greedy. He wanted a bigger piece of the pie. He threatened to go to the federal authorities, another disruption that needed to be managed. Thorne looked at Hank. "You know what to do." Hank and his 3 men spread out, brandishing makeshift weapons, a heavy wrench, a crowbar, a length of chain. They advanced on Reacher slowly, trying to surround him. Reacher didn't wait for them to set the terms. He moved first. He surged forward, straight at the man with the crowbar. The man swung, aiming for his head. Reacher ducked under it, the bar whistling through the air where his skull had been. He drove his fist into the man's solar plexus. The air left the man's lungs in a huge gasp, and he crumpled. The man with the chain flicked it out like a whip. Reacher sidestepped, letting the chain snap harmlessly past him. He grabbed the chain midair, yanked hard, and pulled the man off balance, sending him stumbling forward. A precisely aimed kick to the man's knee joint ended his involvement in the fight. Now it was just Hank and one other. They hesitated, their confidence shattered. Reacher picked up the fallen crowbar. He didn't raise it as a weapon. He just held it, testing its weight. "You want to end up like your friends?" Reacher asked Hank. Behind them, Thorne had backed away towards a pickup truck. He opened the driver's side door and reached inside. He was going for a gun. Reacher acted instantly. He threw the crowbar, not at Hank, but over his head. He threw it end over end, a spinning projectile of solid steel. It flew 20 feet and smashed through the truck's side window, hitting Thorne in the shoulder. Thorne screamed in pain and surprise, staggering back from the truck. Hank and his last remaining friend saw their boss go down. Their fight was over. They dropped their weapons and raised their hands. Reacher ignored them. He walked calmly over to Elias Thorne, who was now leaning against the truck, clutching his bleeding shoulder. "It's over, Thorne," Reacher said. Thorne glared at him, his face contorted in pain and hatred. "You think you've won? This town is mine. Brody will—" "Brody's a coward," Reacher cut in. "And I have the evidence from Allenwood's murder scene that ties the crime to this very spot. You're finished." As if on cue, the sound of sirens echoed from the canyon entrance. Not one siren, but several. Reacher looked up to see a procession of police cars and state trooper vehicles pouring through the gap in the fence he'd created. Sarah was in the lead car, sitting in the passenger seat. She had done more than just help him escape. She had gone for the cavalry. Sheriff Brody got out of his car, his face ashen. He saw Reacher standing over Thorne, the illegal mining operation exposed, and he knew his world had just ended. State troopers swarmed the site, arresting Thorne's men. A senior-looking trooper walked over to Brody and quietly took his badge and his gun. Sarah ran over to Reacher. "I called the state police barracks 50 miles away," she explained, breathless. "I told them everything. About Peterson, Allenwood, the cover-up. I gave them a copy of the original lab report." Reacher looked at the chaos unfolding around him, the arrests, the securing of the scene, the end of Elias Thorne's reign. He had found the truth. Justice was being served. His work was done. He looked at Sarah. "You did good," he said. It was the highest praise he could offer. She smiled, a genuine, relieved smile. "What will you do now?" Reacher looked out past the canyon, towards the open road and the rising sun. "Keep walking," he said. He slipped away before any of the state troopers could ask him for a formal statement. He didn't need their thanks, and he didn't want their paperwork. He walked out of the canyon, found the highway, and started east. The town of Redemption was behind him. It had a long way to go to live up to its name, but now, at least, it had a chance. Reacher didn't look back. There was always another town, another road, another horizon, and he had miles to go before he slept.